4, 3.
Welcome to Casey Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're telling the stories of Kansas City nonprofits and the people behind them. Casey Cares is the intersection of the nonprofit and profit communities, making Kansas City a better place to live, work, and play. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. Many nonprofits begin as a passion project for an individual who wants to impact a particular situation or an issue. However, with founders, sometimes there are challenges that come along with leading a nonprofit, including founder syndrome. Well, what is founder syndrome? Why is it an issue for nonprofit organizations, and how do you tackle it? As part of Casey Cares' monthly Ask the Expert series, we're unwrapping founder syndrome with Dr. Tom Vansaghi of William Jewell College. Thanks for being here, our expert.
Well, thanks, Ruth. And let me say that Casey Cares is a treasure trove for me as a nonprofit leadership professor. It's a great resource, and I'm planning to use it in classes going forward. So I appreciate the work you're doing.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, I hope I get a good grade. That's all, right?
Well, I think I'm the one being graded today, so hopefully I'll be able to pull out a C+ or something. So
I'm sure you're going to get an A+. All right, we got to dive into this. You and I were actually having a conversation about something totally else, and you said, there's this issue that people don't really think about, and that's founder syndrome. Let's start with a good definition. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me just start with the word founder. I think that founders of nonprofits are incredible pioneering spirits, and we couldn't have nonprofit organizations without them. Every nonprofit began as an idea, usually somebody wanting to solve a social problem. Sometimes it's, as you said, a passion project. It's maybe something that personally afflicted them or a member of their family, and they become very passionate about starting a nonprofit. So when founders go through that process, and sometimes ideas, they never get that far. I talk about civil society where citizens discuss problems and issues. Sometimes these issues and problems emerge out of what I call a civil society primordial soup. You can think about it almost like the people, mankind evolving out of the ocean, and sometimes these problems, grow into a nonprofit, and they say, we're going to solve or work on this social problem, and it will become a nonprofit organization. So founders are absolutely integral and extremely important to the nonprofit sector, the third sector. And without them, we wouldn't have a sector. Clara Barton, had she not pushed so hard to create the Red Cross, the American Red Cross, in the 1800s, it wouldn't exist in the United States. So I'll say that. Now, obviously, founders are humans, and they tend to obviously be just filled with passion, and they tend to be very. I did a study on founder syndrome a couple of years ago, really looking at what kind of leadership traits, what kind of personality traits founders tend to have, and there's an interesting overlap between nonprofit and for-profit founders. So nonprofit and for-profit founders tend to be very innovative people. They take risks. They're very proactive. And in some cases, they tend to be very competitive and maybe borderline aggressive. And that's not a bad thing when you're starting a business or starting a nonprofit organization. So these are wonderful traits. But as a nonprofit kind of moves from, there are life stages of nonprofit organizations, from the idea phase to the startup phase, to the growth phase, to the mature phase. So as nonprofits grow and mature, generally adding paid professional staff, growing their programs, increasing fundraising, their boards transform from friends and family of the founder to professional board members, not professional board members, but professional people that bring lots of expertise. Founders sometimes get stuck in that kind of idea startup phase, where had it not been for that founder, the organization would never have moved forward. And so founders sometimes tend to, being kind of more innovative, risk-taking, proactive, borderline aggressive, sometimes, very competitive people. This is their baby. I mean, without them, this thing would never have started. And there's a lot of pride, and there was a lot of sweat, blood, tears, money, time that they poured into this thing over weeks, months, and years. And so the identity of the founder themselves sometimes gets really tied to the nonprofit organization that they founded. And so as a nonprofit matures, the founder can sometimes limit its growth, limit its kind of movement towards being more professional, being more independent of the founder. And as I said, this is not something that happens in every nonprofit. It's very dependent on the founder's personality, their kind of need to control, their sense of ownership and power over the nonprofit. But sometimes, like I said, the founder can get stuck and then not allow or be very they will try to unintentionally limit the growth, limit the forward movement of a nonprofit. And ultimately, Ruth, as you probably well know, that a nonprofit organization belongs to the community. I mean, it's governed by a board of directors. It's, chartered by the IRS. That these aren't like personal businesses. These aren't, family-owned companies. These are nonprofit organizations that serve at the greater good. And so ultimately, you can think a lot about the founder, literally like having a child, like having a baby. You grow it, you feed it, you nurture it, and then eventually you have to kind of let your teen go, and they have to go to college, they have to move out. But for some founders, that can be really challenging. And believe it or not, you probably run into countless examples. It's far more common than you might think, where you run into founders who tend to create issues, problems, conflicts with the nonprofits that they started. And it's totally unintentional. They may not even know they're doing it. I've talked to founders that they're very aware of their founder syndrome, having a hard time letting go. Others are like, I'm ready to just hand it off and ready to
goodbye.
Yeah.
Is there anything, because you were talking about, I'm fascinated by this personality of a nonprofit leader versus a profit corporation. We could go way off on that. We'll do that for another Ask the Expert. But is there anything that's predictive of a quote founder syndrome leader that maybe a young nonprofit could be aware of? And then we'll go into those that, we've got it. How do we treat the illness, so to speak?
Yeah. So I have to say that, in 2018, 2019, a couple of professors and I, Dr. Charlotte Shelton from Rockhurst University and Dr. Yuri Botts from William Jewell College, and I worked on it. We did a study. We surveyed about 107 local nonprofits or regional nonprofits around Kansas City. And we actually did we kind of compared leadership styles of the founders of the nonprofits that we knew still had founders involved with them. And then we also measured the productivity of the organization or of the board of directors. And by doing like a personality or leadership test, we were able to find that founders do tend to be more on this particular leadership test, tended to be more aggressive, defensive type of leaders. They kind of fell into that category more so. Again, I don't want to brand that as a negative thing. I mean, as a founder, God bless them, we need people that are going to be like, go get them. Let's get this done. We've got to make this happen. We have a problem. It needs to be solved. That's great until, you really need to kind of be more collaborative and kind of hand something off that, you literally birthed and created yourself. That's something that can be very difficult. So, so the answer to your question is, it's very hard to know without, you wouldn't necessarily know depending on, I think personality by personality is going to be very, very predictive. Like I said, I think somebody who tends to be more of a hard charger, a little bit harder with collaboration, would probably be more likely to be somebody who would be a fantastic founder, but may likely be someone who is going to have a harder time giving up the reins, when it really needs to happen. But again, this is very subjective. I mean, it's, some people who might be very entrepreneurial spirited, they could start a business, start a nonprofit. In some cases might be like, you know what, I recognize, I'm a great idea person and starter. I'm not a great finisher, and I'm going to get out of the way. I mean, that could happen too. So it really is just very much dependent on personality.
Does founder syndrome tend to occur at a particular time in the life of a nonprofit?
Yeah. So Susan Kenny Stearns wrote a book about the life stages of nonprofits. And, again, I mentioned the idea phase and the startup phase are very much dependent on the founder. I mean, you wouldn't even have a nonprofit unless you had a founder, co-founders, small group of people
Right.
who really want to carry this on their backs. I mean, literally carry it on their backs. And that means giving up weekends and evenings. And, because most of the time you can't, unless you're just independently wealthy or you get a grant, which is probably unlikely to start a nonprofit. I mean, this is just like a volunteer, very volunteer kind of thing. So again, I have nothing but the utmost respect for founders. So, but again, when a nonprofit moves from a startup to a growth phase where they're growing and they're building programs, building staff, I think the founder is probably that's probably where there could be some struggles. Without the founder is probably going to most nonprofits start with a board, and literally, like in Missouri, you have to have 3 people on your corporate charter through the Missouri Secretary of State. I think in Kansas you only need 1 board member. So who are you going to pick? Who are you going to pick? Your mom? You're going to pick your family, your best friend, and these aren't
Don't pick family members.
Well,
No, you're the expert. I would just say, be very
No, and I
careful
don't
when you're choosing who you want to
shouldn't.
sit at that table.
No, you should not. But that's not an unlikely scenario for a founder, because it's just like,
Right.
I just need to get this paperwork completed. I need to submit it. But those aren't people who are really going to challenge the founder. I mean, a founder is going to need it's kind of like Lincoln's team of adversaries, that they're going to challenge the leader. They're going to constantly say, is that really the best idea? Should we look at other options? And so that tends to be, when the nonprofit starts, a very small, maybe not a very well organized board that hasn't been given a lot of thought, because it's literally the founder that's doing everything, and the board just acts as a rubber stamp, and they're not really in a role to question. And then as the organization grows and builds in that growth phase, the board becomes tends to be very they become very appreciative of founders. I mean, the board is like, wow, you're like this sort of saint, you're like Mother Teresa. You've done this amazing thing. And so it's very sort of, it feeds the egos of founders as their organizations become more successful. But as the nonprofit moves from the growth phase to the maturity phase, by the time a nonprofit becomes mature, I mean, that's where you're earning enough revenue to support your programs. Your board of directors is, hopefully a very diverse, well-represented group of people. In Kansas City, there are people from the Northland, Johnson County, Wyandotte County, Kansas City proper, Eastern Jackson County. You have lawyers, accountants, physicians, you have clients that you serve. I mean, so it's a very diverse group, and the founder is no longer controlling who gets on that board. I mean, it's a process that that's done. The board elects and chooses its own members. And that's, I think, where, like I said, between the growth and the mature phase is most likely where a founder is going to probably run into some issues if they're not willing to kind of let it organically move forward.
Do most organizations hit a founder syndrome point in time, or are there just some that it just doesn't happen? It just naturally flows the way, children are born, raised, and go out on their own.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have same family members, same siblings can be very different in terms of how they grow up and what they do. But no, it's not an inevitable phenomenon. Every founder is going to have a different experience. They'll have a different board. It doesn't mean that a more entrepreneurial, harder driving entrepreneurial founder is automatically going to have founder syndrome. I think a lot of times I run into founders who are very cognizant of founder syndrome. They're like, I don't want that to be me. And so they're intentionally trying to kind of figure that out. And then there are just others who just have absolutely no idea. I know that I work very closely with the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership, and I know that just last week they got a call from a board member of a nonprofit. I don't even know the name of the nonprofit, but they literally were just, as a volunteer board member, calling for help at the Midwest Center and saying, we have a founder that's just out of control. What do we do? So that's, I mean, good for that board member for recognizing some
Right.
dysfunction, recognizing this shouldn't be happening. The founder shouldn't be controlling all the money, and there should be some, it should all be done in a very open way, and you should have a treasurer. It gets messy when founders start paying themselves as executive director, and then they're also the chair of the board. I mean, these are the things
Right.
that conflict of interest. And again, nonprofits, and you probably have talked about this for hours, but the last 30, 40 years, nonprofits have become much more professionally run. We have programs like mine at William Jewell College that are training the next generation of students to become nonprofit leaders. And there are, kind of the olden days where nonprofits were just kind of mom and pop. There wasn't a lot of professionalization. But nowadays, I mean, we expect nonprofits to behave ethically, and the IRS has very strict guidelines. Missouri Attorney General, the Kansas Attorney General is supposed to enforce rules and laws. So nonprofits are now held to a much higher standard. And frankly, a nonprofit is just, if the founder is just going to war with itself or with the board or with the nonprofit they founded, it's probably not going to survive. I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to move from growth to decline, and then to determine basically an end of life for the nonprofit, which would be horrible, right? That's not what a founder wants. And I
Right.
should
Right.
say, if I can make one more point,
Sure.
I know I'm being very hard on founders. Our research, our research actually found that most of the time, when founders are still actively involved in their nonprofits, they're actually helping to raise more money, almost 30% more revenue for the nonprofit than when the founder is not present. And the board of directors tends to be more engaged when the founder is still present. So founders being involved, beyond the startup and the growth phase isn't a bad thing, because founders are very, they can be very tied to funders. They're wealthy funders that came along at an earlier time, foundations that got to know them.
Right.
So if the founder can stay engaged, without trying to micromanage, control the nonprofit, it can be a very positive thing for the organization as long as the founder is alive.
We're talking with Dr. Tom Vansaghi. He is a professor up at William Jewell College that has a great program in nonprofit leadership, and we're talking founder syndrome. All right, so we've kind of defined what this is, or organizations may or may not experience it. Okay, you've got it. Your organization's dealing with it. Help us out. What can the board members, the people involved, how can you manage, what can be done to kind of help get through this, what can be a huge hurdle?
Right. And this is where, I think it's 100% on the board of directors. I mean, the board of directors is they're the fiduciary parties responsible for ensuring that the that the nonprofit is sustainable, that it's moving forward, that it has a strategic plan, that they're working on, what does this organization do, 50, 100 years from now. And so the board of directors, when you have a founder who is creating issues, and that the issues could be at the board level, they could be at the staff level, it could be at both. The bottom line is the board of directors needs to address it head on. And that's where it can get very, very difficult. The board, in many cases, or in most cases, they're very much, they see the founder as this kind of very kind of like saintly person. I mean, it's like, you built this, you created this. So it's very hard for a board who is supposed to be autonomous and acting in the best interest of the mission of the nonprofit, the clients the nonprofit serves. to take on the very person who built and created this organization. But unfortunately, that's what it's going to take. I think that I've been brought in as kind of an outside consultant to try and help. I mean, I'm not promoting my own. I think bringing maybe a third party in to kind of mediate, if it gets that to that point, might be something to consider. But I think it's absolutely something that the board, especially the board chair, the executive committee, that's where the real sort of recognition of, we have a problem, what are we going to do about it? I just finished a strategic plan for a nonprofit I won't name, where the founders created the nonprofit in the late 1990s, and they built this thing. It's a couple. They built this from scratch over the last 20, 25 years. And one member of the couple is like, I'm ready to retire. The other one is an employee in the organization, and they are incredibly good at what they do in doing the programs and the trainings. But this person is also, this was their baby. And so they recognize that there are challenges. They recognize that they are exhibiting founder syndrome traits. So in the strategic plan that we just built for the organization and the board adopted, it has a retirement date for the founders. And it says at the end of the strategic plan, the founders will have established. It doesn't say they will retire by the end of the plan, which I think expires in 2026, but it does say that by the end of this strategic plan cycle, they will have at least announced their retirement, and then we'll have a plan in place to kind of begin to transition away from the organization. And of course, I mean, that has to be it's a very delicate situation with any nonprofit when a founder is transitioning out, because again, you have to think about what relationships do the founders or the founder have with funders, with the community? Is the founder the face of the organization? Because what you don't want to have happen is the organization goes into a struggle or a decline after the founder transitions because of a loss of funding, a loss of recognition. So that's where I think having a really solid plan that's orchestrated through the board, maybe through the strategic planning process, where I think just getting that founder to a point of saying, it's time. You've done this for 30 years. You've been at this, you can be very honest and transparent and say, we've had 3 executive directors leave because of the conflicts with you. I mean, right. You can't continue to operate like this. And and again, it's so hard because these are people that are so loving and caring and compassionate. And this is something they did because, again, they wanted to do something good for the world, change the world for the better, solve a social problem. And this wonderful organization wouldn't exist without them. But it's important for them to recognize that. And that's maybe when bringing in a third party might be a little more helpful for the board members who might be very close to the founder.
Where are some places leadership can go? As you say, it's really the board of directors who has to confront this kind of head on. But, where can folks go to kind of figure out how to deal with this? Advice, sure. Expert.
Yes. So I'm certainly happy to be that person. The Midwest Center is a great resource, Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. It's at UMKC. As I mentioned, somebody just called recently with, saying this is a problem, help me with that. They can provide resources. They also keep lists of consultants who have expertise. I'll always be a promoter of Nonprofit Connect as well. They have a ton of resources, trainings. I'm not sure they have specific trainings on this. When we did this research study, we found, while this is a major problem for the nonprofit sector, there was very little research done, very little published research done in this area, which is weird because I run into it all the time. I don't know, Ruth, if you've encountered that in your work, but it happens a lot. And but I do think Nonprofit Connect, the Midwest Center are 2 places to start. And again, I'm always happy to just sit down, talk to a board chair or an exec committee, and just kind of talk about what's going on and how it might be something to head off. Where it gets even more dicey is, like I said earlier, when the founder has kind of planted themselves as the chair of the board,
Hmm.
as the treasurer of the board and the chair as the executive director, when they're sort of in
Right.
control of all of those spots. Obviously, that's a really big headache, a big issue, because there might be board members who are frustrated, that recognize issues, and it's going to have to be them just saying, kind of between themselves, if this is going to survive, if this is going to thrive, we have to do something. So it almost might be like a little bit of a mutiny. But again, I think
Let's hope that isn't the situation you're dealing with. But if you are,
it is, and that's like the worst case scenario, of course. But like I said, the Midwest Center, Nonprofit Connect would be two places I think people can always go for some support.
where can folks find you if they'd like to make a call and say, gee, we heard you talk about this?
Yes, so I did.
How can they find you?
Yeah, so I'm a professor at William Jewell College. That's kind of where I wear a lot of hats. I do a lot of consulting. I also teach at UMKC in the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. I think you'll have my email up at the end of the episode. Feel free to contact me anytime to just schedule a 30 minutes or an hour to have a cup of coffee and just talk about the challenges. And then I'm happy to direct to other consultants and other resources as well.
There are solutions. So we don't want to end thinking people go, oh my gosh, I have a founder. What am I going to do? It's going to be horrible. Doesn't have to implode, but come from knowledge. It sounds like know what you're dealing with. Should you consult a lawyer? I know we just have a minute or so left. Is that something maybe to think about? Or is that a little?
It's possible. I just recently ran into a founder and I don't know the whole story, but the founder, I think, I'm just kind of guessing that they got sideways with their board. And literally the founder just rechartered the whole organization, like just started a whole new nonprofit.
Oh my gosh.
I don't
know. Let's hope you don't get to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's like a really strange situation. I don't know if the board got off the rails, if the founder's still very much there. I don't know if the founder got very much like, they don't, I mean, so that's an option. I mean, that's like a nuclear option of like, well, we're just going to create a new organization and do away with the old one. I mean, that might be where an attorney might be helpful. But again, I feel like there are lots of ways to hopefully find a solution, because the last thing you want is a founder and a board and the nonprofit to go separate, get divorced and have a really ugly, messy divorce, because then the founder is not going to be happy and they're going to be talking to their friends, their funders, and the nonprofit is going to be doing the same. And like I said, that's a scenario where the nonprofit's going to have a hard time surviving into the future if that's the case.
Tom, this was great advice. Something that nonprofits hit, we should all be aware of. It's founder syndrome, but you can get through it and everybody can go on. And as some might say, live a kumbaya life, but keep, working towards whatever the mission of the nonprofit is. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for Casey Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by Charitable Communications, which is also a nonprofit. This Casey Cares segment was brought to you by the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, www.kauffman.org. If you'd like to be a guest on Casey Cares or underwriting opportunities, please visit our website, kccaresonline.org. Spread the love. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Casey Cares Radio and on Instagram at Casey Cares Online. And don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN, 1510 a.m. and 94.5 FM. Thank you for joining us on Casey Cares.